Hey everybody, this is Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com here in San Diego, California. For all things Vespa, whether you got a new one or an old Vespa, we got you covered. But also if you own a genuine product, we got you covered as well. So today, I'm going to go over replacement of the battery and the carburetor on this Buddy 125 scooter. The Buddy 125 and Buddy 150 scooters, imported by Genuine Scooter Company out of Chicago, both have carburetors in them. And one of the downsides of a carburetor is if the scooter sits without use, such as this example, it's very low miles, but it's been sitting for probably at least a year without use, the carburetor will just gum up with the fuel. I have a lot of customers call, say, oh, my battery's too dead, it doesn't crank. You click, no, can I buy a battery from you for my Buddy or any other carbureted scooter? I said, well, I'll sell you a battery, but most likely if the scooter's been sitting for more than 6 months, it's not likely that's gonna maintain an idle. It may start and kind of run, but I'm gonna start out by putting a new battery in this, and of course it's probably not gonna run, and then I'm gonna cover the steps on how to clean the carburetor with just basic tools at home. So let me start by showing what tools and parts I would recommend having on hand before you start a job like this. Well, first of all, you're gonna need the battery. If the battery's dead as a doornail, like there's no click, there's nothing when you turn the key on, it's not likely to take a charge again. Unfortunately, these style lead acid batteries, if they're drained down to zero, they're not gonna come back typically. So for the Buddy scooter, all of them, 125 all the way up to the Buddy 170, they use a YTX 7A-BS. This is the original Yuasa brand batteries, kind of the best quality of the lead acid replacement batteries. There's other technologies in battery replacement. I can't really speak for them for this scooter. I just recommend a good quality replacement sealed lead acid battery. Another item that I typically recommend when you're doing this job, especially if the bike's got some miles on it and you're going to need to drain the fuel tank, it's just replacement of the fuel lines and the fuel filter. Fortunately, it's just sold as a complete assembly for the Buddy, part number GP65212010004, and we always have these in stock. As for materials needed to complete the job, to change the battery, pretty simple, just 2 Phillips screwdrivers. You could probably get away with the number 2, which is just the most common standard Phillips screwdriver, but the battery screws are typically a larger size screw, and I would recommend a number 3 Phillips screwdriver. So if you have a full set of screwdrivers, you'll be covered. And moving on to the carburetor, you'll need good quality number 2 Phillips screwdriver for most of the carburetor work. To clean the varnish out, you can get this from any local auto parts store. It's called Carbon Choke Cleaner. There's various brands out there. One can is going to be more than enough to do the job. You can buy it at Walmart, or you could get it many different places. Pretty common solvent for cleaning out a carburetor. I want to have some clean rags. I recommend like these blue cloths. They don't leave lint behind, which is pretty important. Use a cloth style rag. If you get any lint in the carburetor, oftentimes will cause problems. So I just recommend one of these a roll of the paper shop rags. And to poke out the jets, the best thing I've found is just stranded wire. Say you had an old speaker cable or a lamp cord, just cut it, strip the insulation off, and typically you're left behind with these strands. I don't know if the camera's getting that, but these strands will easily poke through the small jets, which are orifices that are drilled into brass holes, in the carburetor. If you're unfamiliar with those jets, obviously you'll see them further down in the video. And the last thing you want to have on hand, I always just recommend starting with a fresh tank of gas. And I'll show you a tool that will typically start a good siphon to get the majority of gas out of the fuel tank. Then you want to have a jerry can with some fresh fuel, or if you can walk over to the gas station, put a gallon of gas back in here. Always a good idea just to start with fresh gas. I mean, if the carburetor's gummed up with old gas, well, the tank, fuel, is probably in questionable shape, condition as well. It doesn't cost much, just gasoline. If you're wondering how to get rid of the old gasoline that you siphon out, well, you're only going to be siphoning out probably 1.5 gallons at the very most. Typical car fuel tank holds 10 gallons. Say you have 9 gallons in your car or somebody else's car. Put that last gallon into a car. Be completely safe. Unless the gas is just horrible and like 10 years old, I'd recommend getting rid of it. Some place that takes that kind of stuff. But typically you can just heavily dilute it with good gas in a car and you won't have any problem. That's a good way to get rid of bad gas, as I call it. All right, let's start with replacement of the battery. Located underneath the floor mat where you rest your feet. It's got a rubber floor mat that just easily lifts out. There's these little pegs that engage with these little holes. Pretty straightforward floor mat. And then you have an access panel located right in the middle. Number 2 Phillips driver, just remove the 2 screws, they're pretty short. And lift the cover right out. And there's the battery right there. It's got the original battery from when this scooter was sold. I could just tell by the color of the writing on the battery. So remove the 2 terminals. And you can do that with preferably a number 3 screwdriver, but the number 2 works fine. If you're wondering what these extra leads are, they may not be on your particular buddy. That's a battery tender lead, so you could charge the battery without dismantling the cover. It's got a red terminal for positive and a black terminal that's really short for negative. You can't really mix it up. Battery only goes in one way. It's kind of well engineered but simple for how they set that up. Use like a screwdriver to lift the battery out. It's pretty heavy sometimes. Don't really want to touch the post with bare hands. That is lead, which is a toxic element. Just to show you it's dead. You don't necessarily need a voltmeter, but it could come in handy if you're checking out stuff. I know it's dead. It's dead as a doornail. No lights or anything. Can't honk the horn. 0.3 volts. There's like nothing in this battery. It is not coming back alive. So we got a new battery that's fresh off the charger. And we'll check the voltage there. And your 12.88 volts. Any battery that's over 12.8 volts is typically a full charge battery. I'm not testing the battery in its condition. There's a special tool for that, but I know it's a brand new battery, and based on the voltage in it, it's got a full charge. I got the 2 battery screws that are already in there. If you're wondering how the nuts work, it's a captive square nut. So the nut, if you're with a new battery, you slide the nut right in there, and then it will just thread right into the terminal. So lift the wires right out of the way. Drop the battery in with the post facing towards the back. And we have the terminal that goes to the main scooter wiring harness and the battery tender lead. So we'll get the terminal onto the battery post and then go ahead and thread the bolt in and go ahead and tighten it pretty tight. I see a lot of scooters that have loose terminals, and that's the problem, or the corrosion on terminals. A brand new battery, and this scooter is really fresh. The terminals are really clean. If there's any type of corrosion, which usually looks like kind of like white fluff on them, you can take a little wire brush or even a toothbrush, put some baking soda on it, a toothbrush you're never going to use again, and scrub that off. You want to have nice clean metal on the battery terminals. I mean, that could cause a lot of problems with charging and cranking over. So got the positive terminal, negative terminal, and we know the scooter's going to crank over. So ignition's on, pull brake. Definitely not going to start. Needs the carburetor clean. We could keep on cranking. Typically, if it's not going to start after a minute of cranking, you just need to clean the carburetor. Not worth just cranking and cranking. You're going to end up killing the battery and wearing out the starter motor. I would also typically, in my workshop, I'd use that voltmeter to make sure the scooter is charging. I don't have any questions that there's a problem with the charging system. The scooter was just parked and not used. Mat just goes back in place, kind of snaps into place. We have these mats as replacement parts, and they're in various colors. This is a black mat. even though it looks chalky, but if you cleaned it, it would clean up to be black again. All right, so we gotta get access to the carburetor. It's located underneath a seat, and if you owned a Buddy for a while, you push the key in and the off position, then turn counterclockwise, and that's what opens the seat. Underneath the seat, they have this generous bucket, kind of storage bucket for your helmet. There is this little access panel to access a carburetor, but it's rather difficult to get the carburetor out. If you do have a socket set, a 10mm socket, you can remove 4 bolts to get the whole underseat bucket out of the scooter. Makes the job much easier, although it is possible to remove the single Phillips screw and gain access to the bucket, you know, to the carburetor. So just go ahead and loosen the 4 screws or 6mm bolts. Take a 10mm ratchet. And they're all the same screws, so I just typically leave them in the bucket so you don't lose them. And now the bucket magically lifts right out. Keep in mind, they do have some basic tools with these scooters. You could almost do this job with the tools included in that yellow pouch. So go ahead and remove the carburetor. Pretty simple to do. I didn't show this in the beginning of step, but a 12mm wrench to loosen the throttle cable. There's 2 nuts that lock the throttle cable in place. Went ahead and loosened the rearmost nut, and then you slide this little rubber right off the tip that kind of protects the cable, and spin the frontmost nut off, and then go ahead and pull the cable back. And at this point, the cable's partly disconnected from the throttle butterfly. This is a little crankcase vent hose. I usually like to get that out of the way just to make the job. It could stay in place. It just slips right in there. But we'll get that out of the way just to make the job a little easier. Standard number 2 Phillips. You have the air boot that ties to the air cleaner assembly. Go ahead and loosen the screw, and the strap will want to turn. You don't need to loosen the screw and remove it, but take it out enough where it slides right off to that point. And same goes with the front. This one typically doesn't move around as much because it's got a little metal hook that kind of holds it in place. So at this point, we can almost lift the carburetor out. So typically I'll just lift it from the tube, and it kind of pulls the carburetor right away from the intake manifold. Obviously, if you're doing this on an older scooter, an older Buddy, these rubber bits are going to be a little not quite as soft as this nice one that has pretty low miles here. Next, we're going to disconnect the throttle cable. So you just open there, and then there's a little slot, and the cable pulls right out. On some later Buddies, they do have this extra emissions control line, and see how I'm just using my nail and just pushing the hose right off, and it's on this little spigot down here. The early Buddy 125 and all the Buddy 150s don't have that extra line there. So what's hanging up right now is the fuel line, and on the left side of the carburetor, there's a clip that holds the fuel line. This is your fuel line right here. And if you're replacing the fuel filter, you would have a brand new fuel line, so you could probably just cut it if you have a new fuel filter. Watch out, you are gonna have some fuel coming down. I use the needle nose just to pull the little clip off, and then typically you can just wiggle the hose off with a pair of needle nose, and the last little bit you can pull off. The fuel tap, we know is working. There is fuel in the tank, and it's not leaking, continuing to leak out of this line. The fuel tap, or the Petcock as they call it, it's a vacuum operated Petcock, and it relies on the vacuum that's generated from the engine to turn the fuel flow on. When the engine's not running, obviously you don't have fuel flow going to the carburetor. So that's how that device works. The last line that's holding this carburetor in is a combination of the vent hose, which you could just pull right up this way, and the electric choke. uses, when the engine started, it puts electricity to this device that heats it up and turns off the choke. The camera probably doesn't quite get this angle right here. There's a single 2-pin connector with the yellow wires. That's your choke assembly. And just go ahead and push the little tab and you'll be able to disconnect that single connection. And thereafter, there's a couple clips that hold the wire in place. And now we're through the point where we can liberate the carburetor from the scooter. So we're gonna go ahead and 90% dismantle this carburetor. Sometimes you can get away with doing a job, just a basic job, by pulling the bowl off the bottom of the carburetor and cleaning the jets. But I could tell there's varnish coming out of the air ports and also varnish on this needle in here. It's going to need quite the cleaning, if not an ultrasonic cleaning, but we're not going to cover that. We're going to do this job as if we were doing it at home with just basic tools and carburetor spray cleaner. So oftentimes the screws are very tight, so you don't want to stab your hand, so be careful, keep your hand out of the way. We're going to start by taking off the rubber diaphragm. This part is very sensitive to that carburetor spray, and I'd recommend putting down a lot of pressure and turn counterclockwise to unscrew the screws. You can tell they need quite a bit. Keep your hands out of the way. And I always like to start with this diaphragm top. So I'm holding the diaphragm down because there is a spring that's going to want to pop up as that's coming out. And go ahead and lift that out of the way. These parts we're not going to need to clean. They're not exposed to the fuel. I mean, you could clean them if you wanted to. The spring, we'll set that aside. And next we'll pull this diaphragm out. Just carefully pull the diaphragm out. And this relies on the velocity of the air going through the carburetor to change the metering needle, this needle here that meters the fuel. And I know there's a problem because if the camera gets it, there's some varnish, that little brown ring that's on the needle. We're going to need that, clean that off, because otherwise you're going to end up with stumbling and hesitation when you get on the gas. So, but we do not want to clean this rubber bit. And on the Buddy scooters, these tend to last quite a long time. I mean, up in age or high miles, they may have a tear in it. Therefore, you're going to need to replace it. I just inspect it all the way around for any tears. Make sure you don't get any gasoline or carburetor spray on this rubber bit. So 2 parts drop out when you turn the carburetor upside down. We're going to set the diaphragm aside, and we'll put the needle in a tray of parts that we're going to clean. Next, I'm going to remove the automatic choke. This cover lifts right off. Set that aside. And there's a single Phillips screw located right down there. Again, take care not to stab your hand. I'm putting a ton of downward pressure onto the screw directly towards it and turning it counterclockwise. Screwdriver's partly magnetized, that helps. You can just run a magnet across the screwdriver to get it magnetized. So that's a little short screw. Set that aside, and now we're going to lift the automatic choke away. This part typically doesn't need to be cleaned, but again, it's got a metering needle. If there's any sort of ridge or brown crud on it, I would clean it off. But it looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and set that aside. You can just clean this little area with the spray cleaner, the carburetor cleaner. You don't want to spray the whole entire device down with the carburetor spray. And typically these are very reliable. I know people sometimes want to replace them, but oftentimes you have other issues. You can watch some of my other more in-depth carburetor videos on how to test that part. Not really going to cover that in the scope of this video. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and pull the rubber bits off this carburetor just so they don't get damaged by the spray cleaner. And see how I got a screwdriver in there? You can just pry the rubber hoses right off and go ahead and flip it over. If there is fuel, it's going to leak it out at this point. So you want to have rags or something to catch it. The old stale fuel, that's going to drain out that little vent right there. And I'll warn you, it smells pretty bad if you've never done this job, especially as the fuel ages. Next step, we're going to go ahead and remove the bowl. And it's retained by 3 screws. Same technique, just push down and go ahead and loosen them. Don't stab your hand. And then the last one. I'm not going to take apart the accelerator pump. That's what that extra cover is with the 2 screws. Typically we don't need to mess with that. We'll verify that it does function. So these are a different, same thread size as the screws for the top and that choke assembly, but a different length. So we'll set those aside. Next we'll get the bowl off. And what I like to do is give it a little tap with the back of a wrench, because it will free it up. And go ahead and disconnect it. And you can see there is some gunk in here. We'll go ahead and clean that out. Typically I want to start with that. We know the accelerator pump's working because I'm pushing this little plunger and it's spraying out the fluid. But so what I'll do is I'll carefully fill this whole entire bowl about 1/4 of the way with the carburetor cleaner. And take care not to get it on this rubber gasket. You can get a little bit on it, it's no big deal, but if it's soaking in there, you're gonna have some problems. But we'll start by just leaving this and letting that soak. You know, what's on the gasket, you just wipe right off, so it's not sitting there swelling up the rubber gasket. So set that aside for now and move on to the jets in the bowl. There's a little bit remaining gas in there. We'll go ahead and dump that out. Remove the float, another Phillips screw. That screw is definitely pretty grungy, so we'll go ahead and clean that, put that in the parts of that we're gonna clean. Go ahead and lift the float. You have a needle and the float. We can clean all these parts, and as they're all solvent and fuel resistant. So on the Buddy carburetor, whether it's a 125 or 150, identical carbs or nearly identical. There's 3 jets. This is your main jet. This is your idle jet, so when the scooter's idling, and this is the cold start jet. So when the scooter starts cold, it draws fuel from this, in addition to your idle jet when you start it. And then when you're opening up the throttle, it will draw fuel through this jet. There's plenty of videos that cover the theory of operation of carburetors and the Venturi effect and all that. I'm not going to go into that, but we're going to go ahead and remove the jets. Starting with the idle jet. This is typically the first jet that will clog up on the carburetor. Next it would be the choke jet, which makes it impossible to start when it's cold. If you have a scooter that starts cold and then it stalls out once it gets warm, the culprit is this idle jet. And it runs fine elsewhere, that jet's probably fine. But this scooter's been sitting so long, I'm certain all the jets need cleaning. So go ahead and pull that out. Use a flat screwdriver. Remove the main jet. And if you have a 7mm wrench or socket, you can remove this. Alternatively, if you're very careful with a needle nose, you can remove it with a needle nose as well. So this is your mixer jet right here, and I would always recommend removing this as well. You see all the green stuff in there, we're going to need to clean that off. And the last part that oftentimes gets forgotten. You can give the carburetor a tap, and there should be the needle seat drop out. If not, right down the center, you can use object to carefully poke that through. You don't want to distort it or change the shape of it, but you need to use some sort of object to push that through. And if it's really, really stuck, you may need to heat up the carburetor to get that out. But it drops right out, and that part is it's like chrome plated and not just regular brass like the jets. So at this point, we got the carburetor disassembled enough to where we can clean this carburetor body along with the components that are in it that have contaminated fuel that clogged up their jets. So on the Buddy scooter, in addition to the idle speed adjustment, which is this screw right here, there's an idle mixture adjustment. Unfortunately, over the last few years, due to the emissions regulations, they've had to plug this idle mixture adjustment right here. So that was factory set when they manufactured the scooter, and they put epoxy over it. It is possible to carefully heat this up and pry all the epoxy out, which we sometimes have to do, but typically that's not meant to be tampered with. Is what we'll do is we'll do our best to clean out the passages that run by that mixture screw. For instance, if we put this carburetor together and we know for certain all the jets are clogged and it still doesn't idle very well, we may need to go back in there and pry all that out and remove the mixture screw. If you have an early buddy, luckily you can have access to that mixture screw. And behind the mixture screw is an O-ring, a washer, and a spring. So keep that in mind. There's 3 parts that are going to come out when you, in addition to the screw itself that's located under there. So with the bowl, after it's been soaking for a little bit, you can usually use something to kind of just scrape all the varnish. It should be just clean aluminum in this carburetor bowl. And I'm just using like a little pick of, any sort. You could use something like a wire brush, get in there and clean it out. You can just leave the fluid in there. Another thing I like to do is just put all your jets into the bowl. It's a good little containment for the fluid we're gonna clean. I would typically leave the float needle and a float out of that. But at this point, you could just fill it up with more spray, kind of immerse everything in there. And the idea is this solvent will loosen up that varnish that's built up. And kind of leave that sitting. Again, make sure you don't have much of that fluid on this O-ring that surrounds the carburetor. Typically this O-ring will last a really long time. It's just when you ruin it, that's where you just need to replace it. We're going to move on to the carburetor body. Take our new can of spray here and put the hose on it. Want to wear some type of glasses, safety glasses, something, because this stuff tends to just want to spray in your face. And there's just a couple areas. You can see it's for the most part pretty clean. It only needs like a little bit, just sprayed on this area. Same with the outside of the carburetor. Maybe it needs a little bit of cleaning on the outside, just to get all the debris off the outside of the carburetor, because you don't want debris going into the carburetor, into this bowl area. But the most important part is we need to spray through every single orifice that fuel or air flows through on the carburetor. And if you see any little debris builds up, you can use that same pick to kind of scrape it off. We'll start with the first one, which is where the fuel inlet goes, and it will exit out of this, give it a couple sprays. You can carefully use a pick, kind of just ream it a tiny bit, just kind of clean up, loosen up any varnish that may be left behind. And then we'll give it one more spray. You can do it the opposite direction. And I'll go both ways. You can be pretty liberal with the spray. This choke jet, got to make sure that it's clear before you spray any fluid through it. And I'm just taking one of the real fine filaments of stranded wire. And if it's really sticking, it doesn't go all the way through. It kind of dead ends right there. Just kind of run it up and down. And then you could take this straw and put it on top, and you should see it come out where that choke comes out. And then the same goes with the other direction. There's another little port right there. We'll go ahead and stick the hose down here and see if it, you clog off some of the ports, and you can see it sprays right out of that port right there. So I'm just clogging the various ports, kind of spraying it through. The choke also has passages that go through the front of the carburetor and through the back of the carburetor. So every single one. Don't want to miss any of them. So there's several passages on this side of the carburetor that are all part of the choke. So I sprayed through them all. The next ones are the main jet holder and the air passage for the main jet, which is a center port right here. And see how it kind of erupts right out of that hole right there. And then right to the side of it is the air passage for the idle. And you'll see it kind of erupt out of this hole here. So Kind of spray through that. You should see fluid coming out right where the butterfly is. Looks like it's pretty good. That kind of indicates this mixture passage is open. And the last and most difficult passage to clean is the one called the accelerator pump passage. And right to the side of where the jet goes, you can try spraying through it, but typically this may be clogged if it's been sitting. And it's definitely clogged. I don't see any jet coming out of or any fuel coming out of this little passage here. If that's the case, that's typically really hard to gain access to the little port that's on the front side of the jet. I'd recommend finding a pot that this carburetor will sit in, and as this carburetor stands, the body, you could put it in boiling hot water. And typically bring it up to a boil and let it run for 15 minutes with hot water. It'd be safe. Will be enough to loosen up the passage in there, and then you'd repeat with the carburetor spray and spray through all those passages. Also, compressed air helps you out, kind of doing this job like you don't have an air compressor at home. You can always certainly try to poke through this direction, usually no issues there, but you're going to need to poke all the way through that way, which is a very difficult task. So you typically boil that, and you want to spray through and see fuel exit this little jet towards the that brass butterfly in there. The butterfly is what opens when you open up the throttle. Make sure that's free as well. Sometimes they can get stuck, and this one's in good shape, no varnish around it. So that pretty much concludes everything you want to clean on the carburetor body. Moving on to the float, you got to take care. This is a plastic part. You just got to, typically just the pressure of the fluid is enough to free it up, and if there is any little particles stuck on it, you just brush them with a nylon bristle or even a wire brush very gently, and then just give it one final cleaning. You don't want to have any particles fall behind because that could clog up the jets. But that thing's quite clean at this point. I would consider that's good to go back into the thing. This needle, you see I'm cleaning everything onto this this rags that have these lint-free shop rags, and I'll take my finger, squeeze, and just rotate the rubber needle into where I'm squeezing to clean the tip of that. And that's all you're going to need to do. You also want to make sure this little plunger is functioning. I don't know if the camera's getting it. See how it gets a little stuck? And just exercise it a couple times. And that's all you need to do to clean up the needle. Moving back to the jets, I've been soaking for a little bit. We'll pull them out one by one and clean them. So we'll start with the needle. It still has the ridge of that grime on there. Go ahead and just use these lint-free rags to wipe that grime off. And now the needle is just perfectly clean aluminum. Take care not to scratch this or scrub it with a wire brush of any sort. Onto the jets. You have the large air jet. We could rotate that into this rag, and then take your copper wire, and all these really fine holes, these typically get overlooked. You want to poke every single one of them. There's quite a few of them on this jet. I think there's a total of 6, 7, 8, 10 holes on this. So every hole you want to poke it through. It pokes all the way through to the other side. Once you do that, it's usually good enough. To clean the larger holes, I'll just take all the wire and kind of twirl it into this, just send it through, kind of twirl it, and then at this point we can clean it with additional carburetor spray. The idle jet, can be tricky to clear out the small passage, and typically this is the passage that is clogged and why the scooter won't idle or start up. This is the culprit right here. So you take one single strand of the copper wire and just kind of almost like as if you're drilling the copper wire through the jet. And if you're struggling with it, just try a new strand. So once it emerges from the other side, you pull it through and just exercise that right through. And then same with these other passages, they may need to be cleaned. You see my nitrile gloves are deteriorating. That's the side effect of using this spray solvent. It does end up deteriorating your gloves here. So, and the way to check to see if that's clean, see it's coming out as a nice clean jet. No problems there. The last ones, we got the main jet, the little screw that retains the float. And we'll just go ahead and sacrifice my gloves. I'm going to still leave the juice, the carburetor cleaner, in the bowl of the carburetor. Again, make sure that the fluid doesn't stay on the gasket for the third time there. Set that aside. This little needle, you can just roll it in your lint-free cloth. Put that away, it doesn't need much cleaning. The screw head that retained it, use a little wire brush. And this last piece right here, same technique. You could take the bundle of stranded wire and go through it and just kind of rotate it around. The idea is it takes off any varnish. You know, the buildup of varnish adds a small thickness to any of these parts and impedes the fuel flow. And you can give it the final little cleaning with the cleaner and the main jet. Sometimes you may want to start with just one filament to go through it, but typically this hole is a little larger. You could follow up with maybe a pair, even 3 filaments of wire, depending on how thick your wire is. So just have a couple of the filaments and just go right into the jet. I know it's hard to see with my gloves in there, but see how I got 3 through, no problem. Just give it a couple rotates. This is the best way to clean jets. I mean, there's other, you can poke through welding tip cleaners and other steel wire, but sometimes that can distort the jet. So, and then we'll give the final little cleaning here. So that pretty much sums up all the jets. We're gonna go ahead and dispose of that solution there. Don't really want that old stuff in there. And then we're gonna clean the accelerator pump and choke passage. So put some new fluid in there. You can still see there's a little bit of varnish in there. Go around with our wire brush, try to get the majority of it out. Use like a little pick. You can use a paper clip, anything to kind of just get it out of all these little nooks and crannies. The next one we want to check is make sure your accelerator pump. So we got fluid over in that corner that's towards this accelerator pump. So pump it a couple times. You can see it just squirts a real small amount of carburetor cleaner right through this little jet right here. Again, kind of just keep it off. You don't want to remove this gasket. It's typically hard to get back in. And the last jet that we'll need to clean is right where the choke resides, right there. There's a small jet right into the bowl, and you could just use the copper wire, kind of exercise the wire through it, and you could check to see if it's clean by pushing fluid both directions. But you could see even at this point I've gotten a little bit too much fluid onto this gasket here, so gonna want to wipe that down. So we've cleaned the bowl out pretty good right now at this point. Say you did get some onto the gasket and starting to lift the gasket. This gasket's pretty complicated. All you want to do is just take a small amount of thick grease, like this Maxima waterproof grease, and you can just put it in the spots where the gasket's supposed to reside. You don't need that much. You don't want it to contaminate the fuel, but enough where it holds the gasket in place before we reassemble the carburetor. So at this point, you could just kind of work the gasket back into place, and then it will all hold into place. And work it around with the grease all the way around, and it will kind of stay in place. So just like that. See how the gasket, even though it's slightly swollen up and took on some of the solvent, you could always just set it back in place with grease. Otherwise, you're going to be really fighting this gasket quite a bit to get it to stay in place as you're assembling the carburetor. So if you have a cleared up accelerator pump jet, you're able to spray carburetor spray through it and see a nice constant stream of carburetor spray through it. Like I said, every single one of these passages got to be 100% clear for success. If anything's partly clogged, you're just going to have problems. Hesitations, or the scooter just won't run at all. So now that everything's dried out, you can use the aid of compressed air to do that, to speed it up, but the carburetor cleaner just naturally evaporates. I mean, you can smell it in the air. We'll start putting it back together. So we'll take the needle jet, the needle seat there, and go ahead and drop that in. You know, the fatter part is facing towards me. We'll take this jet holder, and if you want to clean things even more, you can get in there with a wire brush, make them just look like they're perfect brass. Not 100% necessary, it's more important that all the holes are all cleaned and poked out. We'll go ahead and thread that in. If you got the needle seat in the wrong direction, it's not gonna seat all the way down. You could cheat it with needle nose like I am here, or you can use a 7mm, 8mm wrench, I think it is. Next, we'll put the main jet in. This threads right in. Take your flat blade screwdriver. Make sure you have a nice square drive. The brass is a little soft, so if you over tighten it, you're going to damage the brass. Same with this jet. If you want to clean the outside of it, not really necessary, but you could do that with a wire brush to get it really nice. Drop the idle jet in and thread that in place. And last, we'll go ahead and hang the float along with the float needle. So this little tang, I didn't move it. We're not going to adjust. There's no need to ever really adjust the float height. The only reason you got adjusted is because if somebody accidentally damaged it and it's no longer in the correct height. So I went ahead and slid the steel pin in there. Carefully drop the needle right in there, but don't lose the jet. I'm just leaving the jet hanging from this little tang in there. So it's kind of a little tricky sometimes. Go ahead and drop that in. And now the little pin is back in the same spot. Phillips screwdriver. Put the single screw that retains the pin. I do like this system. A lot of them use like a pin you got to drive through. And at this point, we could check to see if the float's working. If you draw a plane, and right when the float just stops, like there, this should be parallel. The line that's in the float should be parallel with the plane of the intake of the carburetor. I don't know if the camera gets that very well, but that's the approximate height. There's not like a specified height, but if you push the float a little bit more, you're going against the spring. So right when it just seats. Like I said, no need to adjust it. This one's perfect. Still good from the factory. So everything's assembled in the bowl. Go ahead and put the carburetor bowl on. I put a little bit of grease to hold the gasket in place. And we'll go ahead and kind of slide this all back into place. And make sure it just sits flush all the way around. There's that little bit of grease, not going to hurt anything. I'm just holding it in place, and we'll go ahead and install the screws. And I'm just holding it so it's not sliding around. And at this point, I just want to get all the screws started. And now all the screws are started, we can go around and tighten the screws, and that will seat the gasket. If the gasket's pinched, that's going to be a problem. But that's why I use the grease to kind of just hold the gasket in place. A little bit of that grease oozes out, no big deal there. Next, we can go ahead and assemble the float or the slide. Go ahead and drop the needle down the center hole. So the needle just drops in there, and then there's the plastic retainer that just drops right into the thing. So this only goes in one direction. If you have the other way, it just won't even fit. You want to eyeball down the float, make sure the needle does drop into that center relief right there. Next, make sure that this rubber seats all the way around. Again, if you can't get to seat, you can use a small amount of grease to do so. So drop the spring in there and carefully push that down as perfectly straight as you can and just hold that in place. And if you see how the carburetor is a little cockeyed, that means that the rubber isn't all the way seated. So kind of just go back around. Maybe it'll just give it a little wiggle. And there it is. So pretty close. You know, all the way around. There's nowhere where it's pinched. Just holding some pressure on there. So just go between the two screws. That self-seals that rubber bit. Go in there, you can use the Phillips screwdriver, make sure that returns on the downwards. If you have compressed air, you could certainly blow through this port and this should raise, and that kind of indicates that you have that seated correctly. So go ahead and take your choke assembly and just go ahead and seat that in. If you're having any difficulty, you put a little grease on that O-ring. A magnetic screwdriver is helpful at this point. Hold the screw and just the single screw that retains the choke. And I'm not going to tighten it all the way. You know, enough where I can rotate the choke. So it's got the little cap right there. You know, you can get it approximately where it needs to go. So, and then we could tighten it all the way home. Snap the cover on. That's just a thermal cover. Just goes on like that. And the hoses are pretty easy. So there's the one vent hose port. Put the little elbow hose on there. And the last hose is your drain, you know, the carburetor drain, or if the scooter falls over, it will leak the fuel out. And to use these wire clips, you can use a needle nose. And just kind of give them a squeeze and then just slide it over the hose. And now the clip is holding the hose in place. I would say the carburetor's ready to go put back in. Typically on the bench, I would put fuel into this and make sure there's no leaks. But we're just gonna go ahead and drain the fuel out of the tank, put fresh fuel in, then put this carburetor in, and I'm pretty certain it's gonna run fine. So we're gonna wanna get the majority of the fuel out of the fuel tank. Well, first of all, you wanna take the cap off and look inside the tank. I don't think the camera's gonna get it, but it's a nice clean steel tank. It's full of gas, there's no rust in it. If you have rust, you're gonna have other problems, like you need to get rid of that rust problem, such as replace the tank, or acid clean it, or coat it with some type of material. But this is the best way to get fuel out when you have a full tank of gas. They call this a shaker siphon. You could just use the basic hose where the tank is higher than the tank you wanna drain and start a siphon, either by putting pressure up here with an air compressor, or I don't even want to show it, but like the old movies where somebody steal gas out of a tank, you get the idea. But the shaker has like kind of a one-way valve. There's like a marble on the end. You can find these pretty easily. Go ahead and drop that side in, the shaker, and then hold the other line into a tank that's lower. So the shaker just needs a couple little shakes and we'll get a siphon going. It works very good when you got a full tank of gas. You can see that gas is pretty yellow. And I'll try to get I would say 95% of the fuel out with this kind of device. Works pretty fast. There we go. So we got all the fuel out. Doesn't get much easier than this for starting a siphon. There's other types of ones that have like a little bubble pump, you know, in them, but these work really good, especially if you have a full tank of gas that you need to evacuate out of the tank. So next we'll go over to the gas station, fill up the tank. Don't need to show how to do that. It's pretty much just fill the tank with a fresh tank of gas. If there was no gas in it, be wary that the fuel tap may leak or something too. So we'll go ahead and return the carburetor back to the scooter and get her running. So the throttle pulley is on the right side of the scooter. This goes on to the intake manifold. That goes towards your air filter, larger size. Can't really mix that up. We'll start pretty much in the reverse order. So we'll get the electric choke cable. Go ahead and plug that in. Just snaps right in. We're not going to clamp down the wire all the way because it gives us a little flexibility to move the carburetor around. We're not going to hook up the fuel line just yet. I want to verify fuel flow before I get too far with the carburetor, but we do need to partly install the carburetor. Next, we'll move on to the throttle. So hook it into that little pulley right there. The nut is completely off towards the front, and this thing has kind of a lot of adjustment to it. And typically the way you adjust the throttle cable, so we'll have this nut all the way backed off. So right where you're just pulling on it but not opening the throttle. So that's kind of my rough adjustment right there. Then we'll go ahead and tighten this lock nut. So before we tighten these down, those are just loose right there. We'll move on to the throttle grip and see how much free play we have. So right now there's no free play, it just instantly opens the throttle. If we go back to the carburetor and back this nut off, maybe a turn or a half turn, just to put a little free play. So if you want to add free play, you loosen this nut here. So we'll check it again. Sometimes it's better to have more free play than not enough free play, because otherwise you end up with a throttle that's stuck. So right now, see how there's a little free play in that? That's exactly the way you want it. And at this point, we have those both just hand tightened. We can go ahead and go between the two and tighten them up. And keeping the cable kind of up, pointed up towards out of the intake tube. Then the little rubber boot just snaps right back in place onto the cable. It might not even be there. Sometimes they rot away. You have this vent tube here and the little hose here. Pretty self-explanatory. Just plugs in just in the reverse order. We'll go ahead and put the intake on. And then pop the carburetor in. And believe it or not, I'm not hooking up the gas just yet. That one takes a little bit of force to get in. And if you're wondering why you can't get access to the screw, sometimes you gotta turn the adjuster until the screw is facing up so you can get access to it. Right now, I'm not going to tighten the screws. I just want to verify fuel flow. You got to be careful with this because you are going to be letting fuel flow freely. The carburetor's in there and it shouldn't start because there's no fuel in the carburetor. We're just going to go ahead and give it a couple little and I'm just priming it. Just want to see how I just gave it a couple. It doesn't take much and it should shut off right away. If there's any question about that, then there's a problem with your fuel tap. If it's not turning on and flowing at that rate with a full tank of gas. The vent hose just kind of routes down towards the bottom of the carburetor. And now that we verified fuel flow and it's fresh fuel going through the fuel line, like I said, I would recommend replacing this. But this scooter only has 100 miles on it. Not really necessary to replace the fuel filter, but if it was any older, I'd probably replace the fuel filter. So reattach the fuel line. You can take a needle nose and slide this little hose clamp on. You just squeeze these little hose clamps and then just slide it right on over where the hose, the barb fitting for the hose. Pretty important you have that. You never know, if you hit a really big bump, the fuel line can come loose, which wouldn't be a good thing. And now we can center the carburetor, reconnect this hose here, and say that's a little high. You can always just turn it down so it's resting on top of the rubber boot, and then go back onto this and tighten it. And go ahead and tighten the two screws that hold the clamps for the intake manifold. And after this, we'll see if we can get it started. Don't think we'll have any problem. So the first start, it's going to take quite a bit of cranking just because there's no fuel in the carburetor. Give it a couple cranks. And it may stumble a little bit. Another trick is in here is a air intake boot. Right here. If you're struggling to start it, you can always So at this point, I'm going to allow the scooter to warm up a little bit, and then we'll set the idle speed. So the idle seems a little high right now, but you only want to set the final idle speed when the scooter is all the way warmed up. And you can check to see if the choke is working by pulling this cover off, and this will start to get warm. And I can feel some warmth out of that, so it's definitely working, but I could, it takes a good couple of minutes of operation before we can make the final adjustment to the idle speed. And if we're having trouble maintaining a warm idle, like I suggested, you may need to pry the epoxy off that mixer screw to clean out that passage as well. So we've allowed the scooter to warm up for a few minutes, and now that it's off the choke, you can see the idle speed is just a little too low. So about there, you can kind of hear the beat of what the motor should sound like. These do run a little on the lean side with those mixer screw caps. We could make adjustments to make it run a little bit better, but I think that's the best we'll get it for a warm idle. It's important it doesn't stall when you're riding around and coming to stops, and also important that it's not idling so high that the clutch is engaging and the scooter wants to roll forward. And at this point, we could put the underseat bucket back into the scooter, take it on a test ride, and if needed, we can make some additional fine adjustments to the idle speed after we take it on a good test ride. So a couple other important steps I would take on a scooter that's been sitting for a while, in addition to replacement of the battery and cleaning the carburetor, would be changing the engine oil. Don't overlook the brake fluid. If it's been in here for several years, it may be contaminated and time to change out. Also check your tires, check the condition of the valve stems, make sure they're inflated to the correct pressure. If they're in poor condition, pretty cracked, I would definitely change out those tires before you take it on a test ride. Make sure the brakes aren't sticking and they're properly adjusted. Just because it's running doesn't mean it's a safe scooter yet. So those are definitely other items I would check before I go out on the road test for the scooter and give it a good shakedown. But other than that, that's pretty much all the steps you need to do to get a Buddy scooter or any other scooter that's similar, such as a Yamaha Vino, many Honda scooters, or many of the Chinese-made scooters. They have a very similar setup to this scooter. Vespas, they do everything a little different. And most of my channel, I've covered steps on going through Vespas and getting them running again when they've been sitting for a while. But I wanted to change it up a little bit and do it on another popular scooter here in the United States, the Genuine Buddy. Hope everybody found that useful, whether you just stumbled across this on figuring out how to clean the carburetor, or maybe you've left your scooter too long, or you're a seasoned mechanic and just want to see how I do it. Kind of did it a little different than I normally do. Sometimes I show the professional tools such as an ultrasonic cleaner or compressed air. I wanted to do this video with tools that you just typically have in a home garage. Until next time, it's Robot from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. If you're looking for parts for your scooter, whether it's a Vespa or a Genuine Buddy scooter, we've got you covered. You check us out on ScooterWest.com. If you're looking for a new scooter in your San Diego area, give us a call at 619-280-1718. Subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell to get notifications. I make videos weekly and have several hundred videos pertaining to scooters already up on the YouTube. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Robot here.